Okay, we'll start first with some technical issues. So this webinar is recorded and is broadcast live on Facebook and on YouTube, so whatever we say, it's already been seen also outside. If you have a request for the floor, please write in the chat and my colleagues here will tell me when you want to take the floor. We will take note of it and we will give you the floor. The most important thing is to mute your microphones so that we don't have a disturbance in microphones. So only the speaker should have an unmuted microphone, all the rest with a mute microphone. And of course, let's try to be very short when we make our presentations because time is precious. But I will kick it off now, and let me say that I'm very happy to welcome you to this first OSCE PA webinar. It's an idea that we have to promote inter-parliamentary dialogue among our members. And we decided to start with probably the most important issue, which is the security developments pertaining the ongoing COVID pandemic, but of course the economic security fallout of this pandemic. So thank you very much for your readiness to contribute and to participate with us. Unfortunately, as most of you know, members, cancellation of the annual session and other planned activities prompted this International Secretariat to explore new opportunities to maintain alive this political dialogue. Many members wrote to me, they said, well, if there's no annual session, we would like to remain engaged, we would like to participate. So this is the first of a series of parliamentary dialogues in a web format that we are going to implement on different issues, all in the different dimensions of the OSCE, the political military dimension, the economic social dimension, the human dimension. But it's an opportunity for members to engage between themselves and to contribute. I am firmly convinced that the economic security fallout of this COVID-19 pandemic is particularly important because it requires an international cooperation and a well-informed decisions from our leaders in order to deal with it. I think one of the difficulties that we have is how we deal with this situation. Do we deal more inward looking? Do our countries look at it more from a domestic perspective, or these issues have to be dealt more using international cooperation? I think the latter, obviously, for all of us is the right answer. We need to absolutely increase and enhance international cooperation. So to better understand the short and long-term economic security repercussion of COVID-19 pandemic, we are having this seminar. This is one of the objectives that we have. We also want to share views here on the impact of the pandemic and expected impact on the economic support measures that will be introduced by the participating states of the OSCE, and also to explore what is the kind of contribution that our members of parliament can give in this context. In today's session, we will have three important guests, and I would like to welcome them here. Professor Tria from Italy, Mr. Schlaugenhauf from the United States, and Professor Aber from Austria. I will introduce them later on more specifically about what they're doing, but we will listen to their advice, recommendations. They are big experts in this area. But before we go to the experts, I would also like to welcome our president and ask him to address the Parliamentary Assembly. This is the first time that we are actually meeting since Vienna in a more formal manner. I mean, we've had informal meetings of the Bureau in the same vein with the same system, but this is the first time that we have actually enlarged the meeting to members of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. So, President Saratelli, please address your colleagues, and then we move on to our experts. And thank you very much all for participating. I hope you've all received the list of participants, but I just remind you that there are members from Albania, Andorra, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Belgium, Bulgaria, Canada, Cyprus, Estonia, Finland, Georgia, Germany, Hungary, Iceland, Ireland, Italy, Kyrgyzstan, Latvia, Liechtenstein, Luxembourg, Montenegro, Netherlands, Poland, Portugal, the Russian Federation, Serbia, Spain, Sweden, Turkey, Ukraine, UK, United States. Those who have enrolled, probably there are other members as well that I. Mr. President, the floor is yours. Mr. President, you have to unmute your microphone, Mr. President. Your microphone. Yes, now it's good.
Good now.
Yes, Mr. President. Yes, it's okay. It's okay, Mr. President. You can go ahead. We hear you.
It's okay now?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Dear colleagues, dear friends, it's really great to see so many of you connected today for this first OSCE PA webinar. We tried to be very creative, our Secretariat, Secretary General, all the staff, and they offered this good opportunity. First of all, of course, I'd like to wish you all good health to you and your close ones in these difficult times, and also want to commend you all for being particularly active and engaged in crafting a response to this unprecedented challenge. Our doctors, nurses, and medical personnel, of course, the first responders in this crisis, and we should rightly praise the role of those who are making sure that our lives continue with the semblance of normality. Cashiers, cooks, truck drivers, cleaners, and I think in your communication, in your speeches in the Parliament, you're always mentioning these people, police, army, and so on. But the crisis also revealed the role and the strength of governments and public officials in informing and protecting citizens. I know all of you take this responsibility very seriously. I also would like to thank, of course, and then once again to underline the importance of participation of our speakers, guest speakers. Roberto introduced them, but that's very important. They're joining us today. Professor Giovanni Tria, who is former Minister of Economy and Finance of Italy, and a Professor of Economics at Tor Vergata University of Rome. Jeffrey Schlagenhoff, Deputy Secretary General of the OECD, and OECD, I think, is giving great advices now and at this time of such difficulties, and I think it's very interesting. And Professor Haber from Austria, I expect their interventions will help us better understand the short and long-term economic and security repercussions of the pandemic, especially on international economic and financial relations. Some of the social and economic consequences of COVID are already clear throughout the OSCE region, I think in all our parliaments and in our virtual meetings. Now the main questions are about economy, about possible recession, about possible recovery, and how we're helping our societies. In some countries, for instance, over 10 years of unemployment decrease are being raised, and the jobless rates are skyrocketing. The driving sectors of our economies, the travel, hospitality, tourism, sports, have ground to halt. Industrial supply chains are being undermined, and some key economic indicators are extremely worrying. With the price of crude oil, you see it going negative for the first time in history. So this calls for decisive economic action by our governments and parliaments, which many of our countries have done. And of course, parliamentarians have played a key role in this by passing unprecedented economic aid packages and emergency public health measures. Crucially, parliaments have remained active while respecting social distancing to fulfill their oversight function. In the weeks and months to come, there will be a central part of our work to protect of the most vulnerable in our societies and ensure that economic recovery is rapid and complete as possible. And the global challenge always requires also global response. It has been evidently clear. No state alone can cope with the magnitude of this crisis and its consequences. As member of the OSCE PA, as a members of our assembly, we can very actively encourage assistance and coordination between our countries. There are also some practical examples of our activities in the last month. And our Parliamentary Assembly is also a great platform. I know that we're promoting that for you to share experience and best practices We need it now to learn the lessons from the crisis and be better prepared for the future. So before I yield back the floor, let me thank the leaders of our second committee, Doris Barnett, Arthur Gerasimov, Alona Jebrea, for their work and activities on these issues. And once again, thank you, Roberto, and all our staff for this opportunity to have this webinar and to interact with our distinguished speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. So we now go into the debate, and the first speaker on my list is Professor Giovanni Tria, former Minister of Economy and Finance in the Italian government. He is a full-time professor at the political economy at the University of Rome, Tor Vergata, as the President mentioned. He has over 40 years of experience in economic development, the role of governments and institutions in growth processes, and microeconomic and political dynamics. Signor Ministro, Professore, la parola a lei. Professor Tria.
Hello?
Sì, lo sentiamo.
Now? Can you hear me? Okay.
We hear you. We don't see you. We hear you and we see you. Go ahead. We hear you and we see you.
Thank you, thank you. First of all, I would like to thank you for your kind invitation to participate to this, I think, very important seminar just in front of for the Parliamentary Assembly of OSCE. Well, we all know the coronavirus pandemic started the worst world economic crisis since the Second World War. For the first time, after the Great Depression of the last century, both advanced economies and emerging and developing economies are in recession. The countries that will be particularly hit will be probably the countries more integrated in transnational supply chains, that is to say, the countries that depend on intermediate inputs produced around the world, and the countries also that are suppliers of commodities and raw material, as oil. The crisis arises, as we know, from an almost simultaneous shock of supply and demand, created by a sort of freezing of the economies due to the lockdown and the social distancing measures, which we don't know how long will last. For this reason, we face tremendous uncertainty on how deep and how long will be the recession and how big is the risk of an economic global depression. So it is crucial how fast the governments of all the countries will be able to anticipate the negative expectations of citizens and companies by announcing first and above all, quickly implementing expansive fiscal and monetary measures. The goal we must all have in mind is to find a way to finance immediately the necessary spending on health and the measures aimed to ensure that people are able to meet their needs. Simultaneously, we must support the production system disrupted by compensating the losses of the companies caused by the economic shutdown. Immediately after, it is necessary to finance a massive recovery plan that is investments mainly on health and infrastructures. To prevent companies' bankruptcies, many European countries adopted the mechanism of the temporary transfer to the government of the largest part of the wage bill of companies, the companies forced to halt their production. These measures, together with the credit guarantees, liquidity facilities, granting of grants, should avoid the firms go out of business, creating unemployment, and an unemployment that risks to become permanent or long-lasting, because we know from previous crises that the firm-specific skills of workers quickly depreciate. In other words, while the pandemic doesn't destroy physical capital, destroy both human and entrepreneurial capital. As a result of all these measures, the government debts, which are already very high in most countries, risk to grow larger with foreseeable high pressure on financial markets. In fact, the use of financial markets by both sovereign debtors and companies will necessarily be massive and protracted over time. Sovereign debt is the main tool that all countries will necessarily activate to introduce resources into the economy and stimulate productive recovery, going beyond monetary expansion policies, which have already reached the limits of their effectiveness through the mere reduction of interest rates. The use of debt appears to be necessary, but at the same time, its unlimited growth is probably not sustainable. Under these conditions, the question is whether and to what extent a global explosion of public debt can be avoided. The answer can be to channel monetary resources created by central banks towards financing specific pandemic mitigation public investment programs. A monetization of the additional investment expenditure would allow governments to contain the growth of their debts also in the recovery phase. This direct monetary financing of public expenditure can be achieved in different ways. In fact, all major central banks, including the European Central Bank, are already buying massively sovereign bonds, even if the ECB, the European Central Bank, purchases of sovereign bonds cannot be considered as a monetization of debt or direct financing of governments, as in the case of other central banks. However, the effectiveness of the health and economic measures aimed to contain the spread of the infection and to mitigate its economic impact requires international coordination and cooperation between countries and between multilateral organizations. Monetary policy coordination between central banks is needed to stabilize financial markets and to ensure liquidity for economies and governments worldwide, including maybe the poorest countries. Above all, it's important to avoid that the asymmetric impact of the health emergency among countries and their different financial strength in supporting their companies are used during the lockdown for a sort of beggar-the-neighbor policy. In other words, for aggressive competitive restructuring of transnational production and commercial chains. Global trade is a complex network of exchanges of intermediate inputs regulated by international commercial, financial, and insurance contracts, in addition to national and international norms. What we need is that the private financial sectors find ways to sterilize in some way the current risks on global value chains deriving from potential temporary interruption of these numerous interconnections. This can be done by adopting in novel ways the necessary adjustment and compensation mechanisms. A private sector response may not necessarily be sufficient on its own and may entail stability risks around the world. And for the long term, it will be also risky a reaction by countries that follow the demand to reduce the global connections between economies under the psychological pressure of pandemics in response to political arguments for achieving national self-sufficiency in the provision of essential goods. Restructuring the supply chains in ways that make production costlier would show limited awareness of the interconnections between national economies in the global market. All the energies of governments and institutions seem today mostly focused on coping with the current danger and to imagine the immediate aftermath in the next 4-6 months, whilst the globalized world seems not being questioning itself enough about the long-term perspectives, at least on a public debate. It must not be forgotten that one of the positive effects of an interconnected world is the production of global public goods, like the fight against climate change and pollution, the diffusion of knowledge and education, scientific progress, human rights, the conquest of medicine, and the global fight against endemic illnesses. More attention and concern must be placed in addressing expectations and fears that could deter good choices on a global level. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much, Professor Tria. Very much appreciated. If members have questions for the professor, of course, we'll take them at the end. Now we move to the second speaker, Mr. Jeffrey Schlaugenhauf. He is the Deputy Secretary General of the OECD. Very often members confuse OECD and OSCE. We deal with security and cooperation. They deal with economic development. He served as the head of the Economic Policy Division within the White House Office of Management and Budget, and he has extensive knowledge of government, national and state legislation, and political and public affairs, as well as a vast experience in the Congressional Joint Economic Committee of the US Senate and the US House of Representatives. So you know this platform, Professor, you know the members of parliament and their needs, so I yield the floor to you for your presentation.
Thank you very much, dear President, dear parliamentarians, colleagues, good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me to speak to you today in these challenging times as we face a public health crisis without precedent in living memory that continues to result in widespread loss of life and severe human suffering. As governments take all necessary steps to contain the spread of the coronavirus, a large part of the world is facing stringent containment measures. Activity in many sectors has been shut down completely. Travel and mobility have been curtailed and financial conditions have tightened abruptly. While it is extremely difficult to quantify the exact magnitude of the impact of the crisis on growth, high-frequency indicators in most of the countries throughout the world. Let me point out just a few. In the 4 weeks since mid-March, 22 million Americans, over 13% of the US labor force, have filed in jobless claims. International flight departures from many countries are down 90%. Global oil demand has so fast that supply cuts can't keep up. As a result, the price of oil in the United States fell as low as -$40 US per barrel this week, as producers paid buyers to take the oil off their hands due to a lack of storage capacity. Composite PMIs, a measure of activity in both the manufacturing and service sectors, have declined drastically into contradictory territory in the US, the Euro area, the UK, and Japan. While the longer-term consequences of the pandemic are still clouded by the fog of containment measures, we will face a wide range of serious policy problems. These include rising sovereign debt levels, an increasing number of corporate insolvencies triggering state interventions that will likely distort market competition, changes in supply chain management towards more emphasis on security of supply, the shortening and diversification of supply chains, as well as a potential long-term rise in unemployment, especially in the most affected sectors, such as international tourism, where preliminary OECD estimates suggest a decline of up to 70% in 2020. Long story short, many economies are facing their largest economic downturn since the Great Depression in the 1930s, outweighing anything experienced even during the global financial crisis in 2008-2009. In this situation, we'll be faced with difficult choices requiring you to consider trade-offs between addressing the public health crisis and limiting the economic damage that it has caused and will continue to cause for the foreseeable future. The importance of getting it right cannot be underestimated. We have seen confidence in government and other institutions decline over the past decades. Governments will be judged on their ability to manage the crisis, not only in an effective, but also in a transparent and accountable manner. Taxpayers will want to be sure that they don't pay for wages, food programs, or medical supplies that never arrive. You parliamentarians have a special oversight role to play here. If we do get it right, we will do a lot to restore trust among citizens. If we don't, we will all pay a very steep price. The OECD is investing significant capacity to monitor and analyze policy responses across countries to support them in their crisis response and recovery. We enable exchange and provide advice SME policy and tax administration to employment, education, public governance, striving to help governments evaluate the cost and benefits of various policy options. Yet while there is no silver bullet to address existing and emerging challenges, one thing is certain: we will only be able to emerge from this unprecedented global crisis if we work together as governments, as legislators, as international organizations, in short, as an international community. The OECD itself was born from the ashes of 2 world wars. As the home of the Marshall Plan, it is living proof of what we can achieve together in the aftermath of a crisis. I believe we need nothing short of a new Marshall Plan, and a truly global one, to address the enormity of the COVID crisis and to emerge stronger and better prepared for future shocks. A good place to start is to paraphrase George Marshall's 1947 commencement address at Harvard University, to say, it is logical that we should do whatever we can to assist in the return of normal economic health in the world, without which there is no political stability and no assured peace. While the OECD as an organization has grown since the days of the Marshall Plan, one fundamental has not. This is our commitment to international solidarity. We stand ready to work with governments and other international organizations such as the OSCE to ensure that collectively we will recover, rebuild, and rebuild better. Thank you very much for the opportunity to address you all. It's a great honor, and I look forward to the discussion.
And thank you very much, Deputy Secretary General, for stressing the importance of international cooperation. This is exactly what we're trying to do this at the level of members of parliament. Before I give the floor to the last guest speaker, I'd like to ask members to register in the chat if they want to speak or ask questions immediately after the last speaker. So the last speaker is Professor Gottfried Haber. He's the Vice Governor of the Austrian National Bank and a professor at the Danube University of Krems. He's responsible for the economy and health and economic and financial policy departments. He has many years of experience in the areas of economic policy, national economy, regional economy, banking and financial markets, as well as health economics and management in the health sector. So I'm sure you have all the right background and experience to address our members. So I give you the floor, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the kind invitation to have the opportunity to be part of that discussion. I will try to show you a few slides, so I hope it will work. Just a second for that, please. So you should now be able to see this presentation. Perhaps not, just a second. So I hope you all can see the presentation. Just give me a hint if this is not the case. So let me start on a few words concerning some aspects related to security and to economic fallout, as you wanted me to talk about. Well, first of all, I would like to stress that there are especially, let's say, 4 fields which will be of high interest concerning the navigation through this Corona crisis. First of all, of course, it's an issue related to health. And that means that there has been a lot of number of political measures, starting with quarantine, lockdown, border control, the increase of health expenditure, the build-up of short-run build-up of capacities, and so on. Having said that, because first of all, it's a health crisis and not kind of economic crisis. The remedy for the health crisis has economic and security and fallout in this respect. The second the second kind of aspects is related to liquidity. So let me stress that the first stage of this crisis was kind of liquidity crisis, because private companies had severe decreases in income while still having expenditure, fixed costs going on. And the first and the most important issue with that was to ensure liquidity, especially by enabling additional bank lending to come through this crisis. So that has also several aspects. One of the aspects is the liquidity in the market, liquidity of banks. The other aspect is related to the availability of liquidity. And at the beginning of the crisis, there was no shortage of liquidity, and thus the European Central Bank and the national central banks have decided to make sure that there won't be an additional issue on that. So monetary policy reacted in the sense to adopt to more supply of liquidity with this respect. Because I forgot that in the beginning when fiddling around with the technical equipment, please let me stress the disclaimer that the opinions that I will express here are my personal opinions and not official opinions of the European system of central banks, of course, as is required by our compliance. The next stage is the support of companies, because there is also a shortfall in, let's say, capital related to a shortfall in profits, which is the next stage. And this is addressed partially by public guarantees, which of course also come into the game when we talk about liquidity, but there is also equity support. Perhaps in critical industries, there might be nationalization issues and attempts. Of course, there are tax deferrals, which are possible instruments, and wage subsidies for that. And last but not least, the long-term and long-run issue will be to ensure employment and to make sure that human resources won't get lost within the crisis, as is the case also with the output potential of companies. So one of the main issues and the economic security issue is to make sure that we will be able to navigate through these critical months with lockdown and with public health measures, and to try to conserve healthy and good running companies and private activity, and to ensure high employment. So as you can see, the fields of policy are related to fiscal policies. We heard about that already. Monetary policies, as I stressed, there are some issues related to monetary policy as well. For example, we have liquidity instruments, but there are also potential there's potential additional demand for liquidity, so collateral easing measures for providing additional liquidity are also important. And the third part of the policy fields is the supervision part, where flexibility has been exercised and there is additional flexibility going on. I won't go into details to bore you with liquidity buffers, capital buffers, the composition of capital requirements, other supervisory measures, but let me stress this. It's very important to act quick, to be responsive and flexible, but also to keep in mind that some of those instruments and a large extent of the framework we had built up before the crisis needs to be effective in times after the crisis as well. So we should keep in mind that after the crisis, there should be also efforts to build up buffers, efforts to recover, and also to be fit for future crises that might occur in coming years as well. So don't be afraid. It was the main part of my input I wanted to give, and the other slides are just very short overviews to illustrate some of the points I talked already about. So all of you are aware that there have been corrections to the projections of economic growth in the range of 4 to 10%. Of course, we are all aware that these projections are subject to the duration, to the time extension of the lockdown measures, and can't be forecast in a very exact manner. We have seen decreases in the stock market, of course, related to negative expectations, to the drop down in profits as well. You can see it for several indicators of stock markets. There is also a different, all of the national governments have announced fiscal support measures with some kind of variation among different countries. And the range, as you can see, comes from some percent of GDP to a quarter of GDP. Of course, the composition of these measures is very different. There are guarantees, there are fiscal measures which are effective at once, but we have to be very careful that these important and necessary measures won't be a possible source of future instability and future troubles we could run into. So we will have to spend a few thoughts on how to recover in a very smooth way from this crisis afterwards. And the very last point I would put into the discussion, because I think it's very important, COVID is the main issue at the moment, and it's breaking, of course, but please don't let us forget that there are other very important strategic issues which have not received as much attention during the last weeks, which is natural, but we should keep them in mind as well. So first of all, the discussion of rules of law and democratic principles, which especially in times of crisis, lockdown, emergency measures, has to be discussed and has to be kept in mind. There are still global political conflicts which are a source of instability. Migration issues are still not solved. Sustainability, climate projections, and long-run effects of the crisis, but of unsustainable developments as well. And of course, what could be a learning from the crisis, access to health systems in an international context, as well as the question of statistical issues. How much of the capacity should be available for times of stress should be kept in mind, and perhaps the discussion on capacity in health systems will be a different discussion afterwards. So sorry for raising more questions than giving facts and inputs and solutions, and I'm looking very much forward to a very interesting discussion. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Professor. Very interesting presentation, and I'm sure it will trigger lots of comments and questions. Now, I first give the floor to our rapporteur of the second committee, a committee that deals with economic and environmental issues, Elona Oja from Albania. Elona, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary General, dear President, dear colleagues. I hope all of you and your families are well in this difficult situation that all countries are facing. I would like also first to thank the OSCE PA for organizing this first webinar for these issues, because inter-cooperation is the most effective way that we can all together win this battle against COVID-19. And national responses are crucial, but in medium term, multilateralism is the best way to win this fight and our best defense against future global threats. I would like also just shortly to say some my ideas and comments with regards to the situation, and also that the role that the second committee has in these issues. Only the time will tell us the greatest impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. But again, with unemployment rate soaring and many business closing, it's clear that the economic impact will be profound, to say the least. Small businesses owners, the working poor, underdocumented migrants, the underemployment, and those working in the gig economy are particularly vulnerable. We need an immediate and coordinated actions that utilize the world's best economic practices and proven emergency measures to blunt the impact. Cooperation, as I mentioned already, is needed between countries and within the countries if we hope to emerge from the recession and prevent the worst effect from tackling the hold. But we have to be clear that in our reductions of the false choice between safeguarding the health of citizens on one side and keeping the economy going on other, we have to have a balance. In both, containment and the economic support measures are needed to protect lives and jobs. As I mentioned, the challenge is also to keep this right balance. I think we have all to work together as parliamentarians with colleagues in parliaments from North America, Europe, and Central Asia in order to develop effective policies that prevent widespread company bankruptcies, mass layoffs, and system-wide financial strains. OSCE parliamentarians can share best practices in these online forums, and that I complemented this first webinar that we are organizing together. I hope that more will come and we can also be more effective and most useful by sharing our practices. As parliamentarians also, we have to understand the role of our national parliaments, which is more important and crucial than ever. Parliaments not only hold the power of legislation, but of oversight. So it is up to us to make sure that laws and policies are adopted that targets resources effectively and to ensure that they are implemented properly. We must also ensure in future that our society and our social safety nets are strong enough to ensure that nobody fails within this. Here again, our national parliaments should play an important role. Many countries already have introduced emergency measures to counter the downward economic spiral, but to prevent the recession becoming a depression, as also was mentioned by previous speakers, we need coordinated fiscal and anti-protectionist initiatives that fully appreciate the interconnectedness of the global economy. The COVID-19 crisis could also inflame the tension also in an international level, or it could bring us together in pursuit of common response to the challenge. We have not to forget all the crises that we are in different in several countries they are saving, and to accept also this geopolitical reality. But for the sake of the planet of 7.8 billion people, we have to work together to make sure that it is the latter. And at the end, without not being very long, because I know that there are a lot of speakers, I also would like to mention only two things. The first one, which is related with the Albanian situation. I think it's good when we also brief each each country on the current situation. We have only 634 infected persons with only 27 deaths. And I think that the government has taken proper measures in order to prevent our citizens, but also to not overcome the health sector. But still, this is an invisible enemy, and that's why we have to work together. And the last is also our Prime Minister and the OSCE chairman person in office, Mr. Edi Rama, has said the OSCE, with its comprehensive approach to security, is well capable to promote global response to the global threats that we face. So I hope that in months to come, we'll work close together with the head of the committee, Doris Barnett, with Vice Chair Artur Gerasimov, and myself, together with the team of the OSCE PA and the OSCE in Vienna, in order to make much more robust and sound proposals and to be, let's say, well suited in this unprecedented time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Odra from Albania. So the next speaker is Irene Karalambidis from Cyprus. She's our special representative on fighting corruption. Irene, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. And first of all, I'd like to express our strong solidarity to the people hit the hardest by the pandemic. Dear colleagues, we are dealing with an emergency situation on different levels. In this unprecedented context, the corruption threat is incredibly high and must not be underestimated. Billions are infused into the economy in a fast-track way. Many critical decisions are taken these days, often without adequate knowledge and the required checks and balances. And I am not referring only to contracts for emergency medical supplies. I am also referring to the billions allocated by states in order to alleviate the economic crisis. Let me give you some numbers. Total state aid approved for the period 2008 to 2017 in response to the financial crisis then was 5.1 trillion euros. Total state aid approved during only the period 11th March through to 17th April 2020 amounts to 2.6 trillion, more than 50% of what was spent 10 years to deal with the financial crisis has been allocated within just over 1 month. Good governance in the modern world does not only mean protection of human rights, protection of the freedom of speech, etc. It means prudence in weighing the true dangers that threaten human life, which put the prosperity of millions of people at risk. In this case, the crisis was triggered by a rather simple biological agent, in my opinion, possibly a consequence of the wrong priorities set by the modern world in the protection of its citizens. In the face of this pandemic, governments are now spending mythical amounts of money to keep afloat their sinking economies and avert total economic collapse. If just a tiny fraction of this money over the years was spent in emergency preparedness, research, and innovation, for instance, to develop better medicines or even universal vaccines, I am confident that the world would have been better placed to combat this pandemic. Dear colleagues, I have no hesitation to say that we got many of our priorities wrong. COVID-19 spreads rapidly in humans, at the same time sending patients into hospitals at a faster rate than they are prepared to cope. In articulating these thoughts today, I have no hesitation to state that the European Union, the most well-founded institutional alliance between advanced states, has completely failed to deliver either in vision or in mission. The EU has failed to implement the long-advertised Lisbon strategy aiming to develop the most dynamic economy on earth based on innovation and science, and has failed to deliver in solidarity measures across member states. In concluding this statement, I'm bound to say that while I acknowledge that asymmetric and destabilizing threats across the globe can still arise from governance malpractices in oppressive and undemocratic regimes, such dangers can still arise also from the lack of prudence by democratic governments. The consequences of the latter might prove such as costly. At the end, I would like to say that as a collateral victim of COVID-19, it was also the conference on the role of national parliaments in combating corruption, scheduled to take place in Cyprus in May. Let me assure you that the conference has not been cancelled, but only postponed. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you very much, Ms. Karalambidis from Cyprus, and thank you also for keeping the remarks short, and this is an invitation, of course, I launch to every member who will speak. The next member is Serene Morbogne, the head of the French delegation. Serene, tu as la parole.
Thank you, grazie Roberto. I'm happy to see you here. We are enough far to respect the social distancing. Thank you to the International Secretariat for organizing such interesting event. I share the word sympathy and health already said by the previous speakers. As you may know, France is strongly struck by the virus. I won't go into details, but just give you an idea. For now, more than 20,700 people died from COVID in France. The virus spread very quickly, and we had to take measures to mitigate the consequences of health, first of all, but also in economy. France decided the closure of non-essential businesses, the suspension of all educational activities, and the closure of public services. Consequently, about 20% of the working population is telecommuting, and about 10 million people, that it's say about 1 worker of 2 in the private sector, cannot work. So economic measures had been decided to support labor, business, and vulnerable people. For example, tax suspension, loans guaranteed by the state, emergency income for small businesses, about 1,500 each, solidarity fund, income protection, workers closed businesses receive the major part of their salaries. Social measure for the most vulnerable people. As a whole, about 110 billion euros will be dedicated to mitigate the socio-economic consequences of that crisis. All the states should take measures to reduce the impact of COVID. They should also, when possible, help other countries to go through these bad times to stabilize the global economy. For example, I think about the debt moratorium for poor countries. If not, we won't only have an health crisis, but also an economic and then a political crisis. And we all know where tensions find their roots. I'm sure that our Assembly has a great role to play in this regard. And we also keep in mind the other challenges of OSCE area has to face and deal with. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Morboni from France. Now I give the floor to Andrei Savinki from
Roberto,
delegation.
Yes,
Mr. President.
Roberto, just a second.
Yes, Mr. President.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was very interesting to hear from you and very, very good points. We also should remember that we have guest speakers, and I think the time is quite limited. So if there are questions also, to consider that and to put forward questions to them.
Thank you, Mr. President, for reminding us. And now I give the floor to Savinki from Belarusian head of delegation. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Do you hear me? Everything is fine. Okay. Thank you. And first of all, of course, my also best wishes to all of you to keep yourself in good health. And under these difficult times, especially these quarantine measures, I also wish everybody good optimism. I am perfectly sure that, well, this is a grave threat and it brings a lot of difficulties, but this is not the first and maybe not the last threat the humankind will definitely overcome. Let me say a few words about the situation in the Republic of Belarus. From the beginning, we took a kind of a holistic approach, looking not only at epidemic itself, but also at the impact on economic and political and public life in our country. That is why we decided to use the strategy of softening of the spread of the virus without strict quarantine or lockdown measures. Why? Because we have a quite good potential in our medical system to take care of the people who have carry cases, who are threatened, whose lives are threatened by this disease itself. I'll give you only several figures. For example, at this point in time, we have more than 7,000 beds in hospitals ready to take on patients if they need some special attention. We have 7,000 infected people, but only 100 people need special attention and heavy conditions and support from the doctors. It means that our the system is quite strong enough to cope with the spread of the virus, and we are continuing to focus on, let's say, reducing the negative impact on economic issues, which is also considerable, unfortunately, because what we see is that mostly the service economy, the service sector is infected most of all. And I can tell you that under pressure is now 38,000 legal entities, which in fact employ 620,000 people. And these companies are generating around 14% of GDP and around 15% of all tax comings into our budget. This is an important challenge which we will be facing in the future. We are trying to learn from that situation, and maybe our key speakers will also comment on that. What we are seeing is that at this point in time, the service sector will be reduced considerably. Is it true that we are coming back to, let's say, a production era, when we have to focus on the production of products for basic needs of people? The second point is that we believe that it is also a good time for bigger investment and stronger investment in several sectors. The first is IT sector and the possibility for IT communications between businesses, and also the transformation of the way they are doing business using the IT solutions, which might be extremely important to keep up going under these current circumstances. The second element is more investment, as it was also stated by a number of speakers, investments in healthcare system, which might become a more important and more let's say, crucial sector of economy in the countries like Belarus, for example. And the second element is, I believe that we should also invest more. What we are trying to achieve here, of course, we are providing some support measures for the companies. So first of all, they don't have to pay their taxes. They have tax holidays. They don't have to pay their rent. For the service companies, which are mostly small businesses, it is important. But the bulk of the support is going to people. We are trying to finance people's salaries so that they can stay and overcome these difficulties. We believe this tailor-made approach might prove to be quite efficient because we don't have a lot of resources. We have to count on what we are generating as our own profit. And in that respect, it is also important. We are seeing that regionalization may become an important issue, as it was mentioned by one of the speakers. Regionalization might become a tendency where we should focus on the products which we can produce and which we can sell in the nearby countries. This might well, not destroy, of course, but harden the world labor, the world trade. But I believe we still have a lot of possibilities in sustaining regional trade within our OSCE region, which we also believe a very important element. And under these circumstances, I would like also to bring to your attention that our parliament is playing a quite special role. Maybe you know that we don't have a proportionate system, we have a majority system. Every parliamentarian is elected from a certain electoral district. Under these circumstances, every parliamentarian is linked to a concrete area of land, which he is monitoring and reporting the problems on this territory to the central authorities, so that we are not leaving any part of our territory in the Republic unattended. I believe under these circumstances, this type of elections, this system might be very beneficial in the time of crisis. As at least we are exploring these possibilities, and we will be ready to share these ideas with our colleagues in the future. These are the thoughts, brief thoughts, which came to my mind hearing the reports and the discussions forward. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Savinki from Belarus. Now I give the floor to Jerry Butimer from Ireland, a member of the Irish delegation. You have the floor.
Thank you, Roberto, and Mr. President. Can I first thank you all for and express my gratitude at being able to have this very important virtual online meeting today. It does underlie the importance of the collective spirit and the work ethos of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. And I want to commend all of you for being here and for coordinating, and thank you. I think it is important, arising from COVID-19, that we work together. We have an Irish saying, Ninartica Corlacela, and it is important that all of us, representing our citizens, but also our parliaments, that we combine together to work to ensure that as parliamentarians and as parliaments, that we play a role in building a world beyond COVID-19. And could I just ask a question in the context of he could perhaps come back to that in his Q&A with us as to how he would envisage that happening now, in particular, given that we have a new European dimension and a scenario where the British have left the European Union. It is important, I believe, from a European perspective, that the European project holds together and that there's flexibility and sensibility around the European approach. We do face a huge number of challenges, Mr. President, from an economic point of view, but also from a human rights point of view. And certainly any removal of human rights of citizens across the world is one that we should stand up to and be at the forefront of our thoughts. We have a duty to protect our citizens and their human rights, but also it is important that in this context of an invisible enemy that is attacking us all, that we stand together in a new social contract. And that's why I'd like to hear more about the Marshall Plan idea in a 21st century world, how Jeffrey could see that happen. Arising from that, I think there will be a need for a new social contract, in the context of our experience of COVID-19, which will force us all to reflect and to re-examine not just healthcare policy, but economic policy and the role of parliaments in being able to represent people. From an Irish perspective, we have sadly had 730 deaths, 16,040 cases, but thankfully the majority of people have recovered, and as members will know, we have nationalised our private health hospitals. We have capacity to deal with this, and for the third day in a row, we've seen a decline in the number of cases. But from a national perspective, our economy and our economy was in a good position, which allowed us to bring in a number of supports to citizens in terms of employers, employees, and those who have lost jobs. And I do believe that there is now a need to us to come back. And that's why I think it's important, Roberto, if we can, arising from today, around a new Marshall Plan, be able to develop and talk and how we can place an input in that, because the world has predominantly pressed pause. The world has changed economically and socially for people. Our thoughts about those who have died, and also we acknowledge and support, and I hope from our meeting today we pass a resolution commending all our healthcare workers at the front line in all degrees and forms, our sanitation workers, those who are continuing our food supply chain, because what they are doing in this time of pandemic is absolutely heroic. And as our Prime Minister said, not all people wear capes. Superheroes wear capes, and these people at the front line and ensuring our food supply and our cities are safe and our streets are clean and our rubbish is picked up are tremendous. And my final point is, we as an open economy in our country are faced the brunt of the COVID-19 in terms of the impact on our economy, but also we must remember the impact it has on our citizens. But today is us as parliamentarians coming together. I thank you for organising it, and I wish everybody well, and hope you all stay safe.
Thank you very much, Mr. Buttimer. Dear Jerry, thank you very much also for your proposals. Indeed, after this meeting, we will have a press release where we can, of course, also have an appeal. Just wanted to remind you that our president in different statements and also our members of the committee have already sent strong support, of course, to all the people who are on the forefront of this battle. But definitely we will have also a public moment about this meeting tomorrow in a press release, and we can, of course, include some of the things that you have brought up in this intervention. Now, just a technical point before I give the floor to the next speaker. If our guest speaker are okay, I think we will have all our members speak now and also ask their questions, and then we can conclude the debate with your three, let's say, replicas or replies or interventions, so that we do it in an orderly fashion, because members are still registering to speak. So now, next speaker is Vice President from Sweden, Margareta Cederfelt. She's also acting chair of the ad hoc committee on migration. Margareta, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary General and Mr. President. I would like to also thank my colleagues here and the Secretariat, and I hope all of you are well. And thank you to the speakers for your interesting presentations. And my question for the panel is about economy. As it's said here on the headline, the economy security fallout of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think here about, I would like to have your comments, what you see as real risk for the economy for the future. I would like to also to packet what I really mean. It's the economy we have today. It's based on an open economy, a market economy, and I think it's very good. It has served our countries very well, the economic growth and also everything else that goes with it. But do you see as a risk if we don't manage to have the companies open, if there will be a high grade of unemployment? I could also see that there is a risk for limitation in trade between countries and so on. And of course, we as politicians, we take decisions every day to support the finance, to support all the different areas I talked about earlier. But if you could say something about what you see as a risk with our decisions, if there is something you really say, avoid this. This is really danger if you take this kind of decisions, or this is what you really should keep in your mind. This could be positive. I don't say that you have the key for the future, but you have different perspectives from different areas, from different countries, part of the world, and it would be very interesting to hear a bit more on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Sederfeld from Sweden. And I'll give the floor to Artur Gerasimov, who is the Vice Chair of the Second Committee of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly dealing with economic and social issues and environmental issues from Ukraine. Thank you, Artur. Artur, I see you're unmuted, but we cannot hear you. No, now you're muted. Yes, now you're unmuted, but still the feed doesn't come in. Now you're okay, but we don't hear the audio. Can you try? It appears as unmuted, but we don't hear you. Shall we move to the next speaker and then we try again? Is that okay? All right, so I'll give the floor to the next speaker, who is the head of the Turkish delegation, former minister Nabi Avci. You have the floor.
Yes. Thank you, Roberto. Thank you. Thank you for organizing such a beneficial organization nowadays. Yes, as we all said, COVID-19 pandemic is a major challenge for the entire world. It's true. But major refugee and migrant hosting countries are much more vulnerable. Turkey pays special attention to the needs of refugees as well as outbreaks potential effect on them. As you may know, Turkey hosts 4 million externally displaced persons. Approximately 3.6 million of them are Syrians. We are home to more than 1.1 million foreign residence permit holders. All displaced are able to access basic services, including health, education, as well as legal and social services. But we need more international cooperation on that issue. Otherwise, we cannot overcome these difficulties by strictly national policies. We need supranational policies, especially for all these vulnerable people. One final note, as Irena told about the Cyprus conference, the third conference in Turkey about the Silk Road Support Group is not postponed. It's not. It will be, I hope, held in this coming year. I hope so. Thank you very much again, and I would like to thank also to keynote speakers for their very beneficial comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Avci from Turkey. And we try again now with Artur Gerasimov in Ukraine. Artur? No? Okay, we try later. Okay, then I move now on to Canada, the head of the Canadian delegation, Eddie Fry. Eddie, good morning to you.
Good morning, Roberto. Good morning, colleagues. I just wanted to let you know that it is now about 6:30 in the morning in my part of the world. So we are reaching out across all sorts of timelines to talk to each other. I wanted to thank the speakers, and I do have two questions for them. One is to support Ireland about the new Marshall Plan. We need to discuss that because we need to discuss how we're going to recover. And also, I wanted to know what we're going to do to prevent what seems to be most likely a Great Depression coming back. How can we head that off? What are the things we need to do? I just wanted to quickly tell everyone about what Canada is doing. We have a universal healthcare system, and so our system is capable of coping. Right now, our system has capacity. We do have some problems with the burnout of a lot of healthcare personnel, and we are looking and discussing whether or not we could deal with helping refugees and immigrants who do have medical degrees in some areas. They have stepped up and volunteered and are helping to contain that kind of personnel capacity. We have immediately put out what we call an emergency plan in which we are supporting every single worker who lost their job because of COVID-19 by giving them a certain amount of money, $2,000 each. And because we're a federation, the provinces are now, in my province, they're adding $1,000 to that. So people have the ability to get $3,000 a month so that they can continue to live and pay their rent and do all those things. But we also got support for businesses, and that we're giving businesses 75% top up of their wages. So we're subsidizing wages so that businesses can rehire, even though they're not going to work, but can rehire and keep the place for when we rebound, that we will be able to have jobs for them. I think we have unearthed, as my prime minister said, something really interesting. We've unearthed during this epidemic, there are a lot of gaps where people are falling between the cracks. Vulnerable people, LGBTQ communities, seniors who don't have access to Wi-Fi or the internet. Some migrants, although we are protecting all our migrants, we are continuing with our migration policy. We are just not allowing people to become irregular migrants crossing the US border right now because we have closed down our borders with the United States, which is the longest border in the world right now, and it's always been open. We've closed it. It'll remain closed for another month. So we have been doing stuff to help everyone, reaching out in every single way to reach the people who are unreachable and to people who don't have any ability to get help. We are looking at some issues like students, because some students who have graduated from university don't have any jobs to look forward to because there are no jobs right now. So that's one of the important things that we're trying to get an angle on how we can get those students and see what we can do to keep them with a living wage at the moment. And finally, what we've done, and we've seen this, we have had tens of thousands of people volunteer to go out there who are not healthcare workers and to help people to buy food, to bring groceries in, to deliver medications for them. Just people are all pulling together in this country, and we're such a big country that it's very heartwarming to see that. But what is very important is that our industries, like people that make wine and beer and automobiles, have stepped up to build protective equipment, new ventilators, masks, hand sanitizers. So it is very interesting that while this is a devastating thing for everyone, and we have had to spend about $140 billion up until now, the question how we will recover that is an issue, but it has also done something remarkable in that our country has pulled together in the most extraordinary way, with provinces working closely with the federal government to deliver for people. So I just wanted to flag that. And to also say to all of you, I hope you all keep well. I hope that we see this curve flatten, but we need to prepare for the next one. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Fry from Canada. Now, I just have quick questions for our guest speakers. As I expected, that the debate is very interesting and our members keep on signing up. They want to intervene. Is it okay for you if we do the questions at the very end, and if we don't end right sharp as we had forecast at 5 o'clock, can you stay a little longer? Can you just show me a sign of thumbs up? Yep, okay. That's fine for other speakers. Okay, fine. Then I will now try to again give the floor to our friends from Ukraine, the Vice Chair of the Second Committee, Artur Gerasimov, to see if the audio is working. Artur? No responses. Then we move on to the head of the Iceland delegation, Gunnar Sveinsson. Gunnar, you have the floor.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, very good.
Okay,
Loud and
good.
clear.
Thank you all, and thank you very much for arranging this webinar. In the beginning, I'd like to thank our friend in Ireland for his speech. I totally agree. I have two questions for Mr. Slagenhoff and Professor Tria. One is maybe from an academic view. Has it been studied, or is it possible that some of our decisions as we take as politicians, for example, closing businesses, can create, and that of course will create unemployment. That by that we are creating more social problems than the pandemic, and in the end we might lose more lives through social problems than to the because of the pandemic. Has this been studied somehow? And the second question is, should states give grants or loans to the small or medium businesses, for example, which are in trouble? If you could choose, what would you choose? Grants or loans? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sveinsson. And now I give the floor to another member of the Turkish delegation, Kamil Aydin. Kamil, you have the floor. Kamil, you have to unmute your microphone. I see you still muted. Yes, now it's good. Yes, very good, loud and clear.
Thank you, President. I would like to say good afternoon to all of my colleagues. And I would like to start with my thanks to organizers of such a meaningful meeting in such an unusual atmosphere. And of course, to guest speakers for their comprehensive remarks about the issue. Moreover, I also would like to express my deep grief and condolences for those who have been sacrificed to such a vicious pandemic, and send my good wishes and prayers to those heroes and heroines doing their best to tackle it in every single corner of the world. Dear colleagues, you know, we have been facing an invisible worldwide pandemic, which has already brought about devastating, tragic consequences, mainly in the sense of public health, economy, and social life, with tragic deaths. Due to the horrifying nature of pandemic, namely COVID-19, we are very well aware of the fact that we must fight against this deadly virus at global as well as national levels. As we are deeply saddened by the loss of many lives and suffering caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, as many countries subjected to this pandemic, Turkey, by taking the advantages of strong health infrastructure, put a great effort to implement necessary measures to tackle it. And now I would like to, ask a brief question to the last speaker. You know, when a good friend, Gottfried Haber from Austria, he gave us a very compact information about the danger zone afterwards, and he pinpointed under such headings such as rule of law, is expecting to be solved, climate change, migration, new access to health systems, so on and so forth. And honestly, in that sense, before asking my question, I would like to make a humble contribution, if he may accept it. Why, I think among these topics to be solved afterwards, after this coronavirus, and I think we should start changing our cultural and social, habits. The way of, I think we should start, the change of our way of, let's say, thinking, because this coronavirus, out of this, devastating virus pandemic, we learned that how important to share, how important to feel from the bottom of our hearts and share and do our effort in a very common, atmosphere, in a very common ground. And honestly, I would like to direct my question. Can we add the cultural and social, change, or the social and cultural values? The priority, I think, should be given on top of everything. Of course, I totally agree with his, pinpointing those 4 items. But I think, and I would like to ask my friend from Austria, can we add, above all, our cultural and social, the priority of our cultural values, on top of everything, such as, way of thinking, and of course, sharing and putting the effort on a common ground. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, your friend from Turkey. Now I give the floor to Congressman Richard Hudson from the United States, who is also the chair of our first committee on political and military.
Thank you, Roberto. Assume y'all can hear me. Great. Well, I'm really glad to be here today, and on behalf of all my U.S. colleagues, I'd like to express our well wishes for each of you and your family. I believe this webinar has been excellent, and many key issues have been raised that we, I believe, can continue to discuss and continue to explore, and are good areas for the OSCE PA to work together going forward. I really appreciate all of our speakers. I thought the insight that Mr. Gottfried had when he made the point of recognizing this pandemic is the current priority, but I agree that there are other issues that we must also address. As participating states struggle to curb the COVID-19 pandemic, we cannot take our focus from key economic issues, and one being Russia continuing to engage in predatory pipeline politics, use of energy resources to exert influence and achieve foreign policy goals that have nothing to do with buying or selling of energy. This behavior not only distorts markets that would otherwise be efficient and provide for the energy needs of all countries at a reasonable price, but it is squarely against commitments made in the Helsinki Final Act. It also exacerbates corruption in the region as price gaps are exploited through graft to create fortunes from fraud. Nord Stream 2 is the prime example of this, increasing dependency on a single source. Economic dependency has a political impact. Friends in Eastern and Central Europe will be negatively impacted, and it will lead to instability across the region. We cannot allow one country to increase its stranglehold on European energy. We must look for alternatives to make sure our democratic institutions cannot be held hostage. I urge participating states to continue to efforts to diversify your supply sources and export markets, because diversification is a direct source of energy security. Diversification injects market forces into regions that might otherwise be subject to a monopoly, and this means that diversification leads to a better deal for the buyer of that energy. I strongly encourage all participating states to band together to reject the political exploitation of energy resources and insist on a true market for energy where supply and demand reign, not the whims of a handful of oligarchs. So with that, Roberto and George, thank you for leading us in this call today. Thank you for your strong leadership. And I want to thank our guest speakers and all of my colleagues who continue to come together to overcome this COVID situation we're in, but to continue to stay focused on the work of this important organization. And again, wish you all great health. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hudson, dear Richard. Thank you also for reminding that our president is online here. We are very fortunate to have a president in this moment who's also been in his previous life a Minister of Health. So it's very much in point. And he's also a doctor. So he's also a doctor. So we have the right person in the right place. For obviously technical reasons, like I am managing this because I have colleagues here who help me do who is the next speakers. Normally this type of meetings would be chaired by the president, but I thank also the president for
thank you, Roberto, very much. So that I'm a medical doctor, but it's not easy in my life even more now. And I feel more responsibility in my own country. But thank you, Richard, and all of you. But you are doing it very well. So facilitating this meeting And once again, it's just to say that Secretariat is doing great job. Maybe I didn't forget to thank particular people like Marco Bonapello or Angelica or others who did a great job to put this webinar together. And it's happening first time, so I think it's a good sign that we are creative, we're trying to be active, we're trying to be connected, and that's the value of this organization. By the way, I took this microphone. Maybe can I put a short question to speakers if they are still here? Or sorry, I didn't hear you.
They're collecting questions for our speakers. So you can ask a question now, and then I will give the floor to the next.
Just a question about more global thing. For instance, OECD is dealing with a global agenda of development, and I think in those times, unfortunately, or that's a reality, we forgot about all the global goals that are very important for the development of our societies. You know, there's SDGs, and I know nobody's mentioning now, but what do you think? What's happening now with all those goals, or what the perspectives in coming maybe years? Because everything depends on budget. You know, even OECD is getting money from different countries, we're contributing to development agendas, and then with us contributing to concrete goals. So as some of my colleagues mentioned here, the huge amount of money now are mobilized to end this pandemic, and that's adequate, we understand. And I'm thankful that Irene and others also reminded that it needs also oversight, it needs also, you know, the checks and balances on place, not to channel it in the right way. Human beings are doing all the job. They are signing decrees, and they are signing papers, they are allocating money, they're spending money. So there are many threats. But especially about this development, the global development agenda, how do you see this process? And maybe also the few words about globalization itself. That's, I think, a huge challenge now at this moment. Particularly, maybe also interesting, how do you see even economic rivalry or cooperation with China? That's a big issue now. And whether it will be more cooperation or more rifts or more, let's say, tensions. As we know that in the plans of big countries, and especially the United States and others, to move big productions from China to other countries, and it's also maybe another topic for a global, let's say, development. So, of course, I'm not expecting to cover, you know, deeply everything, but just your vision, your maybe ideas about those important issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. So we will take the questions at the very end. So now I give the floor to Peter Lord Bonas from the United Kingdom, who is the Vice President and is also the chair of our subcommittee on the rules of procedures. Lord Bonas, you have the floor.
Thank you very much indeed, Roberto. Mr. President, good afternoon, everybody, and good morning to Heidi Fry, and thank you for organizing this seminar. I'll be as brief as I can. Can I just say to my friend Jerry from the Irish Republic that I noted his reference to Brexit, and I just want to assure him that there are many people still in this country who want to see the European project succeed and believe that it is extremely important that the United Kingdom stays as close as possible to the European Union, especially in this difficult time. Can I put two particular questions to the speakers? The first is there a preference for direct funding of small businesses from government rather than expecting business to rely on loans from banks which may be guaranteed by the government, but which on the face of it seem to be extremely difficult to get from many businesses. Secondly, a rather detailed sectorial question, and that seems to me to be that travel and tourism and leisure is a sector that will be extremely important to many countries, helping them to come out of this situation. And how do we go about getting realistic coordination between the individual countries? Because it's no good having tourist centers open in one country if you can't get there from the other. So those are two specific questions, if I may put to them. The other thing I would just like to say, Secretary General, Mr. President, many speakers have referred to the importance of parliamentary oversight. And whilst it's not a matter for this afternoon, something that the Parliamentary Assembly might do, I think, is in the interests of parliamentary democracy, seeing what individual parliaments are doing. In the interests of social distancing, for example, the UK Parliament in one house has gone virtually totally online, the other partially online. And whilst it's early days to see how that's going to work out, it's not as satisfactory as it might be. So it'd be interesting to know how all our participating states are managing this particular issue. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. President, and thank you again for the organisation and the opportunity to contribute. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you very much, Lord Bonas from UK. Now, we are still trying to connect with Ukraine. I'm not sure if colleague Artur Gerasimov can be seen or heard. If not, I will then yield the floor back to our speakers, and we will take them again in the same order as they spoke to answer the many questions. And of course, they can take any questions that they would like of those that were brought forward. Just to follow up on what Lord Bonas just mentioned about the role of parliaments. Indeed, this is something that we have very much in mind in the Parliamentary Assembly, and this is one of the reasons why we want to strengthen this network of parliamentarians throughout the world. One of the challenges we have with this crisis is that besides answering to the problems, global problems in a more, let's say, inward-looking fashion, rather than in a cooperative or international cooperative modus, it's also internally, if countries deal with it more with a verticistic, let's say, and more concentration of power in the executives, or whether the parliaments are playing an important role. So it's very important that we strengthen also the parliamentary dimension, which means the oversight of the people through their elected politicians. So this is for us a fundamental issue. I would say we call it in Italian la primazia della politica, the primacy of politics, and that's a very fundamental democratic principle. But I will now give the floor to Professor Tria to take some of these questions. And of course, if there are members who want to take the floor after the three guest speakers have spoken, they can do so. I can see that somebody else also from our colleagues in the staff wants to take the floor. So we will yield back the floor to members and staff later on. But now, Professor Tria, you have the floor.
Can you hear me, I think? Yes, okay. Then I think that there are many questions, some explicit, some implicit, that came from the rich debate and discussion. First of all, I want to answer to some questions first. I think that in this situation, it's crucial that we try to focus on cooperation versus competition. I don't know if this is an answer, because we have to keep in mind that the economic impact in each country depends not only on the length of the pandemic in the same countries, but on the length of the pandemic and what's happened in all the other countries, because the interconnections between economies. Then, as I said a little bit in my introductory remarks, all the governments have to avoid to try an aggressive competitive approach in a situation in which we have interruptions or disruptions, some supply chains, that we have to rebuild that. I think we don't have to underestimate these interconnections. We have to, for example, to think that we have a potential big problem. I mean, not only economic depression, but or recession at the beginning, but we have a risk of a potential financial impact of the pandemic. For example, this financial turmoil can come through many channels. Imagine only the impact of the fall of price of oil. This can create a financial turmoil around the world. At the beginning, we had a supply shock because just for the lockdown, but progressively, this will become, it is becoming a fall in global demand. This means, for example, that we have a problem of urgency. We have to act then. One of the questions about what we have to do with the companies, how to support companies, loans or grants. My idea is that in this situation, in which we have companies without any incomes, they need, of course, loans, but grants, because in this way we can try to keep in business the companies. And in this way, the companies can channel income from workers and all the peoples that works around, that used to receive their income from the companies. Otherwise, we have to imagine a huge system of assistance for everybody. Then we have to avoid a long-lasting recession, keeping in business the companies, also through grants. This, of course, means that we have in this situation favor public debt versus private debt. This is my clear idea. Then I can answer one of the interesting question is that, okay, how to prevent the Great Depression? I think that we have to do something immediately. We can't wait just to support companies and people. But in this way, I don't think that we have to go against open markets. I mean, open markets nationally and at a global level. This the governments, the state have to support directly the companies. This doesn't mean that we have to shift to free market and the real competition in the future. But now we have in some way to defreezing the economy. And we have, this is important, many delegates told that we have to avoid a sort of deglobalization, because we have to be awareness of the complexity of the modern economies. Somebody used to say nothing could be like before, but we have to keep in mind that we can try to improve, to have a better world, but the dynamic and the transition is important. If we destroy the complex interactions of in the global economies, we need a long time to rebuild a new system. This means a very deep and long depression. Then we have to avoid to be too competitive, and we need to be more cooperative, also because, as I said before, we need a lot of money. Government need a lot of money, and then all the central banks have to cooperate to give money to the government. Also, in some way, in not considering some current rules, because in an exceptional situation, we have to look just right to the objective. Then the central banks have to play a big role, I think. Thanks.
Grazie, Ministro. Thank you very much, Professor Tria. I now give the floor to the Deputy Secretary General of the OSCE.
Thank you very much. A couple of questions came up, a lot of them related to the idea of a new Marshall Plan going into the future. So let me tackle that one from a couple of different dimensions at first. Exactly how we do it, I don't have a plan or a straightforward suggestion on that. But I do think where it starts is largely with the countries that are part of the OECD and also part of the OSCE. And I think it's looking around the table and developing a spirit of, and this isn't going to be easy, but a spirit of common purpose in which everybody reaches deep inside and says, even though we're having to do so much to take care of the people in our own countries right now, is there a way in which we can contribute to a worldwide effort to provide relief? And when I first referenced about a month ago, the notion of an aspirational vision of taking George Marshall's quote and substituting in we the world for the United States, saying it's that I was focusing a lot on, to follow to the question that got raised about development. I have responsibility for the development cluster at OECD, which includes the Development Center, that includes both OECD members and non-members, the Development Cooperation Directorate, which works for the DAC, basically the donor countries, and also the SWAC, the Sahel West Africa Club, that looks at a lot of issues in Africa. And this was born out of as I started to look at how this was unfolding and said, okay, whether you like them or not, the United States, the UK, France, Germany, all sorts of people can put border controls in, at least stop cross-border. That's not even a real option for most African countries to be able to do border control. But also because of their fragile healthcare systems, it's going to be a huge challenge, like nothing we've ever seen before in Africa. And so sort of the prescription I've been trying to push there is, as we deal with our own stuff, let's try and look forward. So at the OECD, we're about to, for the first time, actually have a policy paper that just sort of looks forward at what the challenges are going to be and some possible options to address them. That's been put together by the development cluster as a whole is a common starting place for that discussion. So we're hoping we'll have that out in the next week or so. And I'll jump to the globalization question that the president sort of put in particular. I think everybody, when they think globalization, thinks a lot the US, China, again, off again, differences. I don't know where that's going to go. I do know what I sense in the background from the I talked to is that in terms of unity, that we're seeing a lot more unity among the G7 countries, and I'll throw the European Union into that, particularly in dealing with some of the trade issues, some of the medical relief issues, supplies issues, things of that nature. So I think this is an opportunity to show that globalization can work, but at the same time, we need to be very careful that we allow individual countries to maintain their personal identities, their cultures to a large degree, and we unite around what we have in common as opposed to what can divide us. And I think one of the biggest risks here is the what I'm going to call political risk. I remember prior President of the United States Chief of Staff once saying, when he was looking to spend lots of money on pet projects during the Great Recession, the financial collapse, he says, well, you never let a good crisis go to waste. And I think that as parliamentarians, having worked in Congress through this time, one of my big things is to avoid the temptation to see this as an opportunity to push initiatives or objectives of one kind or another that have nothing in reality to do with helping the world from a health perspective or an economic perspective, throw it off track. And I think that's really important. And that's where part of what I mean is getting it right in terms of ensuring political stability. That move forward and how we stay united and stable and don't inadvertently create additional upheaval. And lastly, and then I'll be quiet, or actually not lastly, two more things. The corruption issue is extraordinarily important here. The OECD, along with the European Union, recently put out a paper related from our illicit or task force on illicit trade, where we look specifically at pharmaceuticals. Counterfeit pharmaceuticals, particularly at this time when lots of people are very desperate, are an even greater danger than they normally are. And I think that's something we need to focus in that particular area. But I think corruption, I look at how much money's been thrown out by the US, appropriated by Congress just over the last couple of weeks. And I'm saying, hey, wait a minute, if I adjust for inflation in the last 3 weeks, we've spent in direct spending more than the entire budget was in fiscal year 2002 in the United States after adjusting for inflation. And that's pretty remarkable. And as we all know, criminals follow the money. They're going to go where the money is. And so I think that's where maintaining a focus on dealing with corruption is going to be a key element of maintaining trust from citizens. And lastly, the question on SMEs, grants or loans. I don't know the answer to that. We do have on our OECD website a recent policy paper. If you just go to oecd.org and scroll across the policy arenas, you'll see one specifically related to small and medium enterprises that so far. My general notion is there's not a one-size-fits-all answer. For some countries, it's one will be better, for other countries, it'll be grants. I mean, for instance, in the US, you know, we've had for a long time a generally successful small business administration. Not every country has that. So the answer for the US might be very different from the answer in Canada or Georgia or other places. So I hope that answers the questions folks were asking.
Thank you very much, Deputy Secretary General. Thank you also for making reference to our respective membership of the OECD and the OSCE. It just triggered my attention to the fact that normally when the Economist quotes some statistics of the OECD, they say a club of most rich countries. I really wonder if after the COVID-19 that quote can still be valid, but certainly hope so. Now I give the floor to the Vice Governor of the Austrian Bank.
Try to amend only the things which haven't been said already. So first of all, I think it's important to state that there are several good approaches and several good and suitable ways to address this crisis. So I think one of the messages should be there is a point for coordination, for cooperation, just as our friend from as Kamil Aydin stated. Also cultural and social collaboration and integration. That's really important, I think. But on the other hand, it's also important to make use of the diversity, to learn from different approaches taken in different countries. So it will be hard to find the correct balance for that, and it's important to find it. Having said that, I think which we should keep in mind is that the 2008 crisis was very different from what we face today, because today this is a case where not the banks or the financial sector is the source of the crisis, but the possible solution to the crisis by providing liquidity. And that also means that we should be very careful not to, well, let's say, to overutilize the capacity of the financial sectors. So additionally, for loans and liquidity, there might be instruments as guarantees needed. And then in the second stage, I would propose some kind of smart staging. First of all, provide emergency liquidity to the private sector and the companies, including government instruments, but as one of the questions referred to, relying on the capacity of the financial markets mainly. And then in the second stage, we should have the time and the opportunity to assess which businesses are hit more severely than others, and then to also use subsidies and transfers and all the instruments to compensate for the losses incurred by the measures against the COVID pandemic. So I think we should keep in mind that it is some kind of transitory shock, hopefully, but with a big but. Because some of the sectors, especially transportation and international mobility, trade, perhaps also, or certainly also tourism, might be impacted for a longer time. So first of all, it's a temporary supply and demand side shock. And I would refrain from using demand side stimulus just right now, because people cannot consume. It's due to the lockdown. It might make sense in a later stage of the developments, but at the moment, when the lockdown will be relieved and released, we will see that hopefully most of the industries will recover, and other of the industries will be hit for a longer time, and structural measures would be needed there. So just a few words on the specific questions which I haven't covered with those statements so far. There was a question from Ms. Sedefeld on the do's and don'ts. I think it's not an exhaustive list, but I would suggest, well, no demand side measures at the moment, but at a later stage if needed. No persistent decrease in regulatory and supervisory frameworks, because we will have the need to be resilient and resistant to further crises in the future as well. But we should try to avoid cliff effects, so a smooth transition will be needed. I think that public sector stability and financial stability should be kept in mind, but with a relaxed view on that at the moment, of course. There should be a targeted transfer, a targeted use of transfer and subsidy instruments as well. And we should, and I think that's the main finding from that, and some of the colleagues stated that, provide sufficient financing and capacity for the healthcare sector. So there might be, as Mr. Hudson stated, the issue of economic dependency. I think we should be very careful that there are huge benefits of globalization and integrated markets and integrated societies as well. So we should carefully reconsider just-in-time production issues versus, for example, more kind of logistics, more traditional logistics with not just-in-time supply-side chains. We should use the benefits of distributed distribution and production chains as well, but be careful that in times of discontinuities in logistic chains, that there might be some buffers for coping with that as well. And well, I think as a last point, the very crucial issue will be to make sure that this crisis will be some kind of V-shape as far as this is possible, and that we try to save as many of the businesses as possible over the crisis, and then to provide much, let's say, brain work on the question where might be structural issues and which businesses and industries might be severely hit for the future. And everything, I think, will be related to transport, mobility, tourism, and so on. But I think the key to the solution of the problem is what you do, international cooperation and coordination on data, on measures. And so good luck in coping with that. I think that's very important. And thank you again for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Vice Governor. Before I give the floor to the President for maybe some concluding remarks, and I think we've been very good on time, but of course, if members want to still interject, they can still do so. I'll give the floor to Ambassador Miodrag Panczewski, who is a member of our staff in Vienna. He recently joined the OSCE PA International Secretariat. Miodrag, you have the floor.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Roberto, for giving me the floor, and thank you for our keynote speakers for their interesting presentations, as well as to the members for their contributions. I have a question for Minister Tria and Mr. Haber regarding the support to the economic development, because there are views that the economic development in recent years has been supported through wide availability of the cheap money, in particular through low interest rates on loans. And there are widespread fears that the increased demand for financial support for inter alia liquidity support, as you have pointed out already, will cause the growth of the interest rates and thereby making the loans more expensive and eventually affecting both micro and macro growth negatively. So could you please comment on that? With this, thank you once again very much for your very interesting presentations, and to you and all other friends and colleagues around the table, stay well and stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Panczewski, dear Miodrag. So who wants to go first?
Yes. Mr. Modela?
Yes.
Good afternoon from Cyprus. Good afternoon from Paphos.
Go ahead.
We are in the middle of this global health and economic crisis. While all countries fight to protect their people from the COVID-19 and pandemic, unfortunately, Turkish invade in Cyprus exclusive economic zone
Republic of Cyprus has to fight at the same time the COVID-19 pandemic and also the invasion in its exclusive economic zone. Our exclusive economic zone is part of the European Union exclusive economic zone. So, European Union have to take measures practical to protect its exclusive economic zone. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, colleagues from Cyprus. Now, Professor Aber, you want to go first, or Professor Tria? Austria first. Your microphone, Deputy Governor, your microphone.
Thank you. Thank you. Now I thought you were very brief on that. I think the main question is there a structural shortage of liquidity? And of course, the first reaction is yes. But if we carefully think about it, there might be also reasoning that, of course, some businesses face a shortage of liquidity because they don't have income, but they have expenses. On the other side, people reduced demand, reduced expenditure for consumption, and that means that the liquidity within the system is not subject to a structural shortage. Of course, there might be additional liquidity requirements, which have been met by the 750 billion euro pandemic emergency purchase program of the ECB and other relaxations and expansionary monetary policy. On the other hand, as we expect from a combined supply and demand side shock, inflation expectations have gone down. So to sum up, I don't see a short-term or medium-term risk for an increase in interest rates because economic processes and indicators would show to the other direction.
Danke, Professor Tria.
Yes. No, I can answer. The question was a cheap money, okay, but we have to consider a little bit separately the problem in how to face the economic emergency. In this phase, we need to in some way compensate the income lost by SMEs, companies, etc. Then, okay, they can need some money, but they need the grants, because if we build a huge debt burden on the private sector, it's difficult to have a recovery after the end of the health emergency. What the problem is what happened in the second phase. We need, of course, a recovery plan, and the countries need, the government needs for that a huge amount of money, mainly for a big investment program. Investment programs on infrastructures and on health infrastructures, but not only health infrastructures. This is not a new problem, of course, because even before the pandemic, the level of private and public investment around the world were too low also in comparison with the liquidity. Then we have to think why. We don't have a real answer. We didn't have a real answer, but now, of course, we are in a in an emergency situation. Then we need more invest. Then in the second phase, more public investments for infrastructure everywhere in Europe, in Italy, of course, but also in Germany, also in the other countries, also in the United States, and also in developing countries, because we are in an interconnected world with almost 8 billion of people now, 7.5 billion people, hyper connected through information technologies, but not really interconnected with enough infrastructures. This is a real a problem for the security. This is a bomb for the world. Then, of course, we are to have this kind of perspective. But now we have to think to the emergency. Of course, the government have to spend more. They need money. They needed to build some debt, and the money have to come in this situation from central banks. The problem is what will happen, which can be the how to manage the exit. This is, of course, is a problem to exit. But now we don't have in the near future a problems of, for example, inflation. But if we use the new money printed by central banks for investments, real investment infrastructure, in front of this money, we will have real assets, not just current expenditures. Then it's true, we have to think about the main problem that we'll have, I think, is that after, if we succeed in collecting money, how to use that? This is a big problem. For example, this is a big problem in Italy. In Italy, we had low rate of growth, and we had a very low public investment, very low the rate of public investment, 1/3 less than before the financial crisis of 2008. And the problem, and this the reason is not because we didn't have money, funds, but because the public administration didn't be able to design projects and implement projects. These are big issues. In Europe and in Italy, for example, we are discussing a lot how to collect money from the financial markets at the national level, at the European level, etc. But we are discussing less on how to use this money. And if we are ready to use this money, this is the real problem in many countries. I don't think in most countries, but in many countries. It's not just the problem of cheap money, but it's probably how to use this money. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tria, Professor Tria. This is it triggered me what you said when you said it's a security issue. This is indeed what this organization is about. We are an organization dealing with security. So despite the fact that today we have talked about the economic and social fallout of this crisis, it is indeed a security issue. You use the word, it's a bomb, you know, the economic crisis that could develop out of this. It just triggered my...
I wanted to say that the half of the is in emerging and developing countries. And we have to remind that 40 years ago, we had about, if I remember, 4 billion.
2 billion.
in 1950, we
oh,
were 2.5 billion people. Now we are going to 8 billion. This change everything, and nobody is thinking about that in the advanced countries and also in what we call the emerging countries, but quite advanced emerging countries.
I could not agree with you more. This is exactly two figures I could give you here. In 1969, when I was born, I'm 50. In 1969, the world population was 2 billion. Now it's 7.3 billion. So this is one first issue. And the other issue is that 160 years ago, 99% of the GDP of the world was in the hands of 1% of the population. Now we are doing better. Now 80% of the GDP is in the hands of 20% of the world. But the big problem, and you talked about interconnected world, the big problem is that 80% can see how the other 20% lives, and this is a security problem that we have to deal with. So thank you very much for this data. Unless there are any other speakers, I will hand over. Yes, Nabil Avci, former Minister of Turkey, head of the Turkish delegation. Nabil.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. We were talking about COVID issues, about international cooperation, about health issues. But unfortunately, Cyprus friend distracted the agenda, so I have to say a few words to Columbus. First, the Cyprus problem is not an issue of invasion or occupation. Its solution will entail the creation of a partnership between the co-owners of the island. Co-owners of the island, to replace the one destroyed by the Greek Cyprus side in 1963. The division of the island began in 1963, much earlier than 1974, when the Greek Cypriots expelled the Turkish Cypriots from the partnership state, organs and institutions, as well as from their homes in violation of the treaties of 1960 and all human rights. Second, the restrictions.
Nabi, I don't mean to interrupt you, but can we just keep it short? Because, like if we turned into a debate, between Cyprus and Turkey. Yes, please, very quickly, and then I will have to give the floor, of course.
Restrictions imposed upon the Turkish Cypriots have no legal and legitimate basis. The United Nations Secretary General, in his report, 28 May 2004, following the unemployment referenda, stated that in the aftermath of the vote, the situation of the Turkish Cypriots calls for the attention of the international community as a whole. That's all.
Thank you very much. As you know, the spirit of this assembly is that we try to build bridges, so let's try to keep that spirit there. I appreciate that there is no replica request from Cyprus, so thank you very much. So I'll give the floor to President Tsereteli to conclude our debate, if he wants to say a few words. And
thank you.
Before you close, Mr. President. Before you close, Mr. President, I just would like to thank also all the colleagues and the staff of the OSCE PA Secretariat who have helped us put together this. So, Mr. President.
So thank you. I'll be very short. I think there was a lengthy but interesting discussion. Of course, first of all, appreciation goes to our speakers. It's not easy to cover everything in all the details, but the professional assessment was very interesting on micro issues and more global, let's say, outlook of the events. We as a political security organization, we have our goals, but at this moment, of course, our goal is to keep this oversight and keep the eye on issues and events are happening around us in our communities and in OSCE area, which is quite a big area, almost 1 billion people. 57 countries. So I think with with such events, with the exchange of our ideas, listening to speakers, listening to professionals, because we all, of course, we have our maybe narrow professions, some of our doctors, lawyers, economists, and so on, but we are making and we have to make sometimes painful and sometimes very important decisions in coming weeks and coming months. We are all following the curves. It's flat, it's down, and hopefully it will be more downtrend in many countries. But it's also in this time and in this period, there are other issues emerging. And first of all, it's our citizens, our people, our economies, how this exit strategy will be effective and with the less damage and with the less, let's say, losses. So, and I think with this, it was very interesting. Of course, there's always an attempt to put forward some national issues. It's important and it's interesting for all of us, what's happening in our countries and how we can, let's say, replicate, or we can just maybe even refuse some policies which are not right at this moment. But now I think the divisions between the political groups, which are leftist and a right and a conservative, I think it's not a time for this at this moment. And when we will end this pandemic, and I think as professionals are expecting in a few months, we can go semi-normal environment. Let's see, we don't know yet. But it's important that we as a parliamentarians be functional, be active, and attract attention of our citizens on important issues, and of course to respond to their needs and their sufferings, and it's a lot of them. I can judge what's happening, for instance, in my own country and many other countries. Of course, there are different possibilities, different level of preparedness, different economic means, but there are, sometimes the unique, let's say, decisions that should be for everybody in a similar way when it comes to public health and social distancing and so on. But I think in coming weeks, I'd like to repeat it, economy will be the dominating issue. And I guess we should have to repeat this type of discussion maybe several times, especially on economy, when we can also discuss with each other and exchange ideas. What are preparations? What decisions? Which laws? Which let's say legal acts we'd like to implement? And this important information, I think, will be really, really valuable for all of us. And I think Parliamentary Assembly can play this very good role. You all know that there are issues of course, human rights and proportionality of measures and legality and a lot of things. And we're trying to follow all these events and follow all these issues. Well, our committees will be more active, and our members are always eager to tune and to talk as it happened today. And I think that's the essence of our work. And I'm very happy that I'm surrounded by colleagues here, now virtually, who really knows what essence of to be a parliamentarian and understand well what they have to do. And of course, cooperation with governments, with the private sector, it's very important. We need good examples. We need good practices. We don't know, but I'm 55. I've been minister for a while. I've been chairman of the healthcare committee for a long time. We had few threats of pandemics. You remember that? But, and it was a real pandemic, for instance, AIDS, but it was not that, let's say, painful for the big layers of our society. Now we see a huge scale of that. And it's a novelty for us. The one, how to cope with this, and then how to have this right exit strategy, as Professor Tria mentioned. So we are thankful to our experts once again helping us to elaborate the right policies. And I think that with help of our secretariat and especially I mentioned few people, Marco still here, Bonabello and others, we'll have other opportunities to have this this type of discussion. And as Roberto said already, we will of course get all the important information. It will be then spread through different channels of press release and so on. And also I'd like to thank all my colleagues here who wrote with the help of our staff, nice, interesting op-eds. There was recently of Lona and Roberto's and ours, and a few others, Margareta, Kari, and others. And that's work that we have to do, just to interact with other world and spread the message which is right at this moment. We parliamentarians have to be functional and active. It would be virtually or in our actual work. So once again, thank you very much. We are all tired a little bit, time differences also, but the only thing at this moment I'd like to wish you, it's a peace and health. So that's I think most precious for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Before concluding, I also want to say a word to thank all the members who have participated, but also those who were not visible online, but they were connected. Secretaries of delegations, many delegations were connected. The OSCE structures in Vienna, we have people from the OSCE institutions of Vienna who have participated also, and also the OSCE field missions in Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan were connected to this webinar. So thank you very much for your participation, and in particular to members and secretaries of delegations, please do feel free to give your feedback to myself, to our colleagues, like this was the first of a kind that we did. So if there are things that need to be fine-tuning, as I always ask, please feel free to give us your inputs, advice, criticism, whatever. We are ready to improve the service that we provide to members. So thank you very much for participating in this. With this, again, I would like to thank all the colleagues who have set this up, both technically and in substance here at the Secretariat. I think of Marco, Anya, and other colleagues, Angelica, who helped us with the technical facilities here in the Secretariat, but many other colleagues I have not mentioned, but I thank all my colleagues at the International Secretariat and all of you members. And with some of you, of course, we will meet again on Monday in our official Bureau meeting, where we will also take important decisions for the upcoming months. So thank you very much all. Of course, you can remain connected between you if you want to chit-chat, but I will close my intervention here, but the system works. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Goodbye. Good luck.
Thank you all. Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Yes.
Grazie.
Keep well and healthy.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Archin.
Okay, many thanks, Roberto. Mr. President,
Thank you, Peter. Thank you.
Good wishes to everyone.